I think the biggest puzzles now are about the U.S. labor market. Growth is slowing down, not dramatically, but the labor market is not showing it.
In this program, distinguished economist Alan Blinder puts some historical context to these interesting times in the United States economy regarding its fiscal and monetary policies.
I've always thought, people have been asking me for a long time, when is the Congress going to get serious about reducing the budget deficit? And I've been answering for a long time, but not lately, when interest rates go up. I'm not so sure about that anymore.
Alan Blinder is professor of economics at Princeton University. He's also a former vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board and former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. In his latest book, A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, 1961 through 2021, Alan Blinder walks us through the story of how the U.S. economy arrived at where it is today, with all its twists and turns. He was invited to talk about his book by the IMF Research Department. Here's a slightly abridged version of his talk.
So I want to preface this putting up a simple Economics 101 framework. Some of you may have taught Economics 101. I do at Princeton. I have for many, many years. And according to that macroeconomic basics, either monetary or fiscal policy can be used to manipulate aggregate demand. So if the problem of the day, as it probably is in the United States today, is too much aggregate demand, either monetary or fiscal policy can be used to simmer things down, throttle things back. And if you have the opposite problem, an inadequate amount of aggregate demand, either one can be used to push it up and get the economy growing faster. So a naive thought might be that the two policies typically cooperate, like you have a left oar and a right oar and you're rowing a rowboat, and you do a lot better, as everybody who's ever either tried or succeeded in rowing a rowboat knows, by rowing with both oars rather than just one. That's a naive thought, but in the immortal words of Richard Nixon, which some of you may remember, that would be wrong. If you look over the history, and that's what this book is about, you find a few episodes of cooperation between monetary and fiscal policy, rowing in the right direction towards the same end. But also you find several in which only one oar was in the water, many of those, or they were actually rowing in opposite directions, and that doesn't really do very much good. So that's going to be one of the main themes in the next half hour. Who plays first violin in this orchestra and who's in second fiddle? And that has varied a lot over time, just to preview it, as you'll see. So, starting at the beginning, Keynes came to America with the Kennedy administration. America was more or less hung up on this idea that deficit spending was an unmitigated evil and you should never do it. Kennedy broke that taboo. I hate to say this, but he broke it with an important speech at Yale University, a place you may have heard of. And at the time, the U.S. federal government had a budget deficit, A, and secondly, the U.S. economy was recovering from a recession. It was not sliding into a recession. So it was quite a break from the orthodoxy of the day for Kennedy to propose a tax cut in that environment. And indeed, he was not able to get it through the Congress before he was assassinated. And this is one of these questions where you never can know. I have some doubt whether, absent that assassination, he ever would have gotten it through the Congress. It's amazing from the current perspective. Just imagine somebody now on Capitol Hill proposing a tax cut, and all kinds of members of Congress from both parties are against it. It doesn't ring true to the year 2023, but it did to the years 1962, 1963. It was clear that monetary policy was playing second fiddle, if at all. The job of monetary policy then was conceptualized, including by the Federal Reserve, to accommodate the tax cut, not let the tax cut push interest rates up and, as we would say now, crowd out private investment. The term accommodative monetary policy, in case you've ever wondered, comes from that episode. Monetary policy was supposed to accommodate. Now we just use it as a synonym to ease. Anytime the Fed eases, we call it accommodative. Monetary policy, you might ask, accommodating what? The answer was clear back then. Here is an amazing quote a couple of years later.
And here, Professor Blinder presents a slide to the audience. It's a quote from the economic report of the president in 1968 and says, in quotations, "It has been and remains the conviction of both the administration and the Federal Reserve System that the nation should depend on fiscal policy, not monetary policy, to carry the main burden of the additional restraint on the growth of demand that now appears necessary for 1968.
In 68, Johnson was urging the Congress to raise taxes as an anti-inflationary device. And just look at this. I bolded two things that are amazing from the perspective of 2023. It has been and remains the conviction of both the administration and the Federal Reserve System. Let's stop there. Can you imagine Jay Powell and Janet Yellen, not Janet Yellen as Fed chief, but Janet Yellen in her current job, signing on to the same document and saying, this is what both of us think we should do? I mean, everybody would scream, central bank independence, central bank independence. And then the rest is even more amazing, that the nation should depend on fiscal policy, not monetary policy, to fight inflation. Can you imagine anybody, anywhere, any economist saying that in this day and age? No. This is an illustration of to what extent monetary policy was in the back seat, then later to assume the front seat, as you all know. So Johnson finally, as I said a moment ago, asked Congress for a tax increase to fight inflation. Remember, that was supposed to be the main way we were fighting inflation then. And it took another 18 months to pass in 1968. Amazingly, I realized that when I finished this book, looking back, that was the last time, 1968, that fiscal policy was used to fight inflation in the United States. 1968. Next, we come to what I call here the notorious Nixon-Burns episode. Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns were friends from before, from the Eisenhower administration. So they were far from strangers. They were buddies in a sense. But there is, as this audience knows, but less sophisticated audiences wouldn't know, a new economic literature on fiscal dominance. Richard Nixon had a simpler view of fiscal dominance, which is the White House should dominate the Federal Reserve. And he had his buddy Arthur Burns running the Federal Reserve, and he thought it was natural to run on a re-election program including both highly expansionary fiscal policy, which he could do partly by executive authority and partly with the Congress, and monetary policy, which Burns would do for him. And at the Federal Reserve, this is considered a black mark in the Fed's history, that Burns was far too cooperative, and that was one of several, not the only, one of several factors that unleashed inflation in America. Then came the supply shocks. And here's a case where it really is important to step back into history. There is a view these days that central banks should try to look through supply shocks because, the price of oil will come up and then it will come down. So it'll be causing inflation on the way up. It'll be causing deflation on the way down. And it's not the business of the central bank to try to change that hill very much. That was not the view then. In fact, the view then was, what in the world is going on? That is, we central bankers, it wasn't only the Fed, the central bankers around the world, are used to a world where excess demand gives you inflation and high employment, and a shortage of demand gives you low inflation and high unemployment. And now they had the two evils going together, inflation and high unemployment at the same time, and they didn't know what to do. So here's some illustrations. On the fiscal side, this is kind of amazing. President Ford, he asked Congress to raise taxes in '74. Now remember, I just said '68 was the last time Congress or the president tried to fight inflation with contractionary fiscal policy. This didn't go anywhere. This was not passed in '74. or October 74. And by January 75, only a few months later, Ford was back asking for a tax cut to fight the recession. So this is an illustration of fiscal policy. Like, what are we supposed to do here? We have both of these problems. It's a little less dramatic with monetary policy, but also monetary policy under Burns and in other central banks around the world vacillated, not knowing what to do. The next episode is Jimmy Carter, who I call the bad luck president. Now, he had bad luck in international affairs, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Carter saw the economy as still maybe a little bit weak and advocated a fiscal stimulus, not a big one, when he came into office. Congress gave him less than he wanted, so there was a tiny fiscal stimulus. And then there is this, I don't know whether I call it a legend, an exaggeration that his Fed chief, G. William Miller, who didn't last long on the job, was soft on inflation. And there is truth to that, and there is especially truth to that if you compare him to Paul Volcker, who followed. That was night to day. But it is the case that in Miller's brief tenure as chair of the Fed raised the federal funds rate about 450 basis points in a relatively short period of time. If they do something like that today, everyone's going, wow. In fact, that's about what the Fed has done recently. 1979, of course, was the year that OPEC II struck, and more importantly to this story, the year that Carter replaced Miller by Volcker at the Federal Reserve, probably dooming his presidency. And I think there's evidence, for example, in Stu Eisenstadt's biography of Carter, that Carter probably realized that putting in Volcker and what Volcker would do to stop inflation was going to make it very difficult for him to win re-election. But to his everlasting credit, Jimmy Carter did not try to interfere with monetary policy and gave Volcker a free rein. Do what you must to stop inflation. And Carter knew it wasn't going to be good for him politically. So Carter loses in the next election to Reagan. Reagan inherits Volcker as his Fed chief. And this is the biggest clash in that 60-year period between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Volcker is tightening monetary policy starting in late 79 and getting more and more serious as the early 80s go on. Allegedly converting to monetarism. I use the word allegedly advisedly. If anyone wants to pursue that later, we can. But the timing is the key thing. Reagan wins the 1980 election. He's president in 1981. The tax cut passes in August 1981. It comes in three stages. A tax cut in 82, 83, 84. So if you think about the timing of these two oars, the Fed's oar is rowing against inflation way before, and now come the Reagan tax cuts rowing in a pro-inflationary. Not that they wanted to cause inflation, but this was based on supply-side ideology. So there's a fight, so to speak, not a literal fight between the two. But the timing is crucial. So because of the timing, the U.S. economy has a serious slump. First, a short one in 1980, and then a longer one in 81, 82, followed by a boom as Volcker eases up with inflation conquered and the Reagan tax cuts come online. And so this is the period of mourning in America and the re-election of Ronald Reagan in a landslide. Now, if you were teaching Economics 101 at the time, which I was, you would have told your students, as I did, that that kind of a policy mix is going to shoot real interest rates into the stratosphere. And if you're the United States of America, appreciate the currency dramatically. I'm sitting here in the IMF. That's not a recipe for every country in the world to get their currency going up. But if you're the United States of America, it is. It was highly predictable. And probably everybody in this building has a mental picture of what the dollar did in 83, 4, 5 until the Plaza Accord. That, by the way, is where the term Rust Belt originated. It just decimated American manufacturing. And the other two parts of the Reagan legacy were the large fiscal deficits that would stay with us for another 15 years or so, and the replacement of Volcker by Alan Greenspan. This is one of those interesting cases did he jump or was he pushed? If you read Paul Volcker's autobiography, which I recommend to you, you still won't know. So I think this is a simultaneous jump and push at the same time. It's clear that the Reaganites wanted to get rid of Volcker. It's not so clear whether Volcker wanted to stay or not. I think he himself was somewhat ambivalent, but Jim Baker took care of his ambivalence. The Bush administration, Bush was famous for his pledge when he ran for the White House of no new taxes, which of course he had to renege on. The notable thing here is that the Reagan legacy basically eliminated any thought of using fiscal policy to shorten a recession. So the idea of fiscal policy to kill inflation was gone a long time ago. In this period, the idea of using it to shorten a recession was also gone because everybody was just focused on deficit reduction, period. He also agreed to PAYGO, pay-as-you-go financing, which was the sleeper in the deal. I remember at the time, most of the journalists and others, even politicians, said, "What's that? That's nothing." That was the big deal, the PAYGO, and it really did help America get the deficit under control. And the other thing worth noting is that like the Johnson administration and like and to some extent the Reagan administration, though less overtly, and most administrations prior, the Bush administration officials beat up on Greenspan constantly. They would be rating him for being too tight with monetary policy, not shortening the recession that was killing Bush politically, and Bush then blamed Greenspan for his defeat, and he was probably right. I was in the Clinton campaign, and I don't want to say we were grateful, but we were certainly cognizant of the fact that the recession was killing George Bush's popularity ratings. Okay, I just mentioned Bill Clinton. Two things to say about the Clinton years. I could say a lot more, I was there. There were two huge reversals. One is what I was just leading to, that Clinton finally grabbed the deficit bull by the horns. George Bush had started and proposed to Congress a serious deficit reduction. So deficit reduction means you're either raising taxes or cutting spending, and Clinton proposed both. Neither one of those is very popular politically, so he knew he was putting his popularity on the line. He spoke as if, this is an interesting case to economists, he spoke as if the fiscal multiplier was negative, which made his Keynesian advisors, I was one of them, wince in private. In public, we didn't wince. But in private, we were wincing. Because think what he said. He said, the way we're going to grow the economy is to reduce the deficit. Now, parse that a little. We're going to make the economy grow faster by raising taxes and cutting spending. Really? But this was part of Clinton's genius. That kind of sales pitch got the program through Congress, barely. If Clinton had used the sales pitch that we, his advisors, used on Clinton, it would have failed. What was that? It's familiar to all of you. You cut the deficit to get real interest rates down, to get more business investment, which will raise labor productivity and raise wages. So it's about raising wages. You've probably all told this story to somebody at some point. That would not have sold. We would not have gotten the deficit down on that. So Clinton gambled that he could reduce the deficit and still grow the economy. How was that supposed to work? Clinton understood that interest rates had to come down. And that meant one of two things, and he was hoping for both. That the Federal Reserve would continue to forbear at a federal funds rate of 3%, zero in real terms, or even go down. I'm sure he hoped that. Or the bond market would rally and long rates would come down. And that did happen to a very large extent. There was a huge bond market rally. The Fed's forbearance only lasted a few months. And I can tell you from personal experience that Clinton was absolutely livid. I didn't see him throw a lamp against the wall or anything like that, but I and a few others were in the White House as he was digesting, as we were trying to calm him down and saying, you couldn't expect the Fed to stay at a zero federal funds rate forever. And he was just so angry at the Fed. But, and this is the important thing, He never made a peep in public about that. And instead, the mantra from Bill Clinton down to people below me on the hierarchy, we all said when asked by the media about the Fed, we don't comment on the Fed. That was a neutral statement. Notice if we would applaud the Fed at some and not at others, that's like commenting on the Fed. It was we don't comment on the Fed. And I want to emphasize to you how important that was for the Federal Reserve and what a departure it was from past history. The past history was nothing like that. Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, almost all of them berated the Fed for being too tight, not Clinton, and it paid off. Clinton is followed by George Bush the Jr., George W. Bush, and his legacy of budget surpluses didn't last very long. Bush didn't believe in paying for anything. There's a saying, the sins of the father are visited on the son. This is the reverse. The father, George Bush the first, put in pay-go, which was very important in getting the budget deficit down. One of the early things George Bush Jr. did was abolish pay-go. And he didn't pay for anything. He didn't pay for the war. He didn't pay for the Medicare expansion. He didn't pay for the tax cuts. Everything went on to the budget deficit, which quickly moved from a big surplus that Clinton had left to a big deficit. At the end of, so that was early in the Bush presidency. In the later part of the Bush presidency, we had the financial crisis, as you know. And a tax cut was, of course, the Bush answer to anything. You know, the question, what's the problem? Don't finish the question. The answer is a tax cut. So he recommended and Congress passed the smallish tax cut. There was more to come later. And the Fed then really assumed first chair here and cut the interest rates to the Fed's version of zero. As probably a lot of you know, the Fed just won't go negative, even though many other central banks have, and create an alphabet soup of liquidity and lending facilities followed by QE. So the biggest burden was on the Fed. And notably here, this was the first time in decades, I've raised this question of who's sitting in first seat and who's not. This is the first time in decades when both authorities, fiscal and monetary, realized that the problem was so big they had to both attack it however they could. And the first but not the last. Of course, the pandemic was a repeat in that sense of that. Obama then becomes president. Bernanke is still heading the Fed when the recession gets really bad. The Recovery Act passes at the beginning of the Obama administration. Seen at that time and criticized by Republicans, this is going to sound a little familiar to today, as way too much stimulus, way too much increasing in the budget deficit. It was about 5% of GDP. John Boehner, who was then the Speaker of the House, in one of my least favorite phrases ever, kept calling it job-killing government spending. I never confronted Boehner. I was not in a position to do that. But I always wanted to say, tell me exactly how that happens. The government either spends money on its own or buys things from somebody else, and that kills jobs. How is that supposed to work? Anyway, that was the negative fiscal multiplier again. The Recovery Act was criticized both for being too little and too big, as probably a lot of you recall then and since. And what's less known is that after that, starting in the years 2011, 12, 13, fiscal policy in the U.S. turned notably contractionary. Well, there's a lot of talk about the slow recovery from that recession, and hardly anybody mentions this obvious fact. I don't want to say nobody mentions, but not many. There was a fiscal contraction of about 1.5% of GDP per year for 3 years running. Barack Obama and Ben Bernanke, crossing the line to fiscal policy, were both basically pleading with the Congress not to do that. But their pleas went unanswered, and the Congress did do that. So it's clear that one of the reasons for the slow recovery was fiscal contraction when they shouldn't have been doing that, making the Fed the only game in town. The reason Ben Bernanke was doing this was saying, we're doing I'm paraphrasing. Fed chiefs speak in much more measured tones. Paraphrasing in an exaggerated way, he's saying, look, you guys, we're doing everything we can here at the Fed. We need help. But he didn't get help. So this brings us to Donald Trump, and obviously coming near the end of the story. Donald Trump reminded a number of us of LBJ in a couple of respects. This was one. He came in proposing, and Congress passed, a sizable tax cut in an economy that we thought was at full employment already, just as Johnson had put in the Great Society and Vietnam spending on top of full employment. And interestingly, but not surprisingly, while a candidate, Donald Trump berated the Fed, then headed by Janet Yellen, for being too loose. You may remember he called her political. She was trying to get Hillary Clinton elected and a number of other nonsense things like that. Then he became president. He put in his own Fed chair and then started by berating him for being too tight. This is an example of political logic triumphing over Aristotelian logic. In the way we economists think of logic, this was illogical, but politically it was not illogical. And as I alluded to before, he asked his attorney general about his ability to fire Powell, and he got the same answer that LBJ got. Then COVID hits. Trump supports Congress's gigantic fiscal stimulus, about 10% of GDP, twice the size of the Recovery Act of 2009. And the Fed is now doing everything it could think of, bringing back everything it had done in the financial crisis, adding more. And just as a by the way, on the sub-theme, there were things in the CARES Act that basically directed the Federal Reserve to do things, like support the PPP program, like Main Street lending and things like that, which if you look at them, were incursions on Federal Reserve independence, but there was no fight about that. It wasn't like Jay Powell was fighting this. No, we don't want to do that. I mean, it was pedal to the metal, and fiscal and monetary policy were both doing everything they could to right the economy. This brings us to the current president. Joe Biden came in and got Congress on a highly partisan vote to pass another large stimulus package, the American Rescue Plan, in March 21. About $2 trillion over 10 years, but front-loaded, so a lot of it came soon. And it's been criticized both at the time and right up to the present time for being one of the causes of the inflation that ensued. I think there is qualitative truth to that charge, but quantitatively, this is my opinion, based on modeling by others, quantitatively not that much truth. That is, it was a small cause of the inflation that we've suffered. Notably, unlike Reagan and Volcker, the Fed did not make any effort to offset this. So the Fed may have thought this was too much fiscal stimulus also. They didn't say anything about that. But what is clear is they did not try to offset it with tighter monetary policy. So we did not get a repeat of Reagan versus Volcker. And beyond that, it took a whole year before the Fed started raising interest rates. And that, as everybody from Jay Powell on down has recognized, was a policy error, that they waited too long. Something that's not been mentioned by anybody, but I want to say it right here. Biden, without making any fuss about it, went back to the Clinton policy of don't yell at the Fed. They don't keep saying we don't comment on the Fed. I haven't heard that phrase from any of them in the administration, but they don't comment on the Fed. Try to think of one single thing the Biden administration has said about the Fed. It's hard to think of anything. And in particular, as it says at the bottom, it would have been kind of natural for a politician when he's suffering at the polls from inflation to say, I didn't do that, it was the Federal Reserve. Blame them. You didn't hear that from Biden, not a bit. So very quick summary of the three themes that I mentioned at the outset. I've been concentrating on the top one, which has evolved from fiscal policy being in the driver's seat in the 60s to monetary policy by the end of this period clearly being in the driver's seats. And what I've emphasized in the last half hour is a lot of ups and downs. This was not a linear path. The other two, which I've just touched on a little bit, were much more linear. The attitude towards budget deficits shifted from the early 60s to they are terrible, immoral, ruinous, calamitous, etc., to the, many of you old enough to remember Alfred E. Newman in Mad Magazine? He used to say, "What, me worry?" He wasn't worried about anything. And that's the attitude towards budget deficits today, except when they use as political excuses for doing something else. And central bank independence, something I didn't mention. If I was talking for an hour and a half, I would have mentioned. Central bank independence was in the 60s something between an afterthought and an idea rejected by both the left and the right. And today, of course, it's mother's milk. Everybody believes that central banks should be independent, and most of them, well, this is the IMF. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are, and certainly the Federal Reserve is strongly independent from the administration and the Congress. And that's where the story ends. Thank you.
That was Alan S. Blinder, professor of economics at Princeton University. He was also a former vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board and a former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He was talking about his latest book, A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, 1961 through 2021, published by Princeton University Press. Look for other IMF podcasts on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.